back to the second session. I'm joined in this session by four of the leading industry glitterati here, three heads of audio from facility companies and a live sound mixer. In this panel we're going to discuss the advantages and the disadvantages of loudness mixing and the creative challenges that it throws up. So let me introduce the panel. First of all, on my left I've got Andy Payne, who's a sound supervisor for outside broadcast company SIS. And next to him is Mark Owen, head of audio at Evolutions. Then I've got Ben Hooper, who's head of audio at Prime Focus. And on the end we've got Steve Cookman, who's head of audio at Molinaire. So maybe I'm going to start with Steve, actually. How do you approach a mix that when you're mixing for loudness? Do you approach that differently to mixing for peak level?
Certainly with the documentary side we do. I think the drama side, when we're mixing for a drama for TV, quite often we've found that once you finish, your results will be fine with adhering to the R128. Documentaries can be different because I think we get a lot of pressure from the directors about pushing up levels for things, primarily music, sound effects, and that can then lead to problems. So you have to sort of throw out the PPM meter and just mix with your ears, and then at the end of the mix analyse it with your Dolby meter or whatever it might be. And it's getting that light and shade, and you obviously have to tweak your mix accordingly.
Ben, does it differ much between genres?
In our department, about 70% long form and about 30% short form, which is promos and commercial stuff. For the long form, I mean, much like yourself, beginning of the day you kind of set a level. We tend to still use PPMs just because historically as mixers we're kind of used to the idea of a PPM, and I know it's going out of fashion. But once you've kind of set the volume of your room and you've got used to it in the first half an hour of the mix, and your dialogues are sitting around 5, you know, you kind of start ignoring the meters and you just mix away for the day. But we've got a useful little trick where we leave a final mix track in Pro Tools in auto track punch record, destructive record, and you can get to the end of a day's mix, and we've got a Nugent plugin, and at the end of the day's mix you can just hit analyze and it will tell you very quickly where you're at within the parameters, so that's really useful.
The -23 limit, do you use that as a kind of budget when you're mixing? Do you sort of work out where in your program you've got light and shade, loud and quiet?
We tend not to have enough time to really plan it so well. I mean, you know, you haven't got very long to mix a program. You start at the beginning of the day, you head down, you get to the end of the day, and you know, usually then you're under pressure to lay back. So certainly in documentaries, there's not really a lot of time to take that into account.
It's just a question of experience. It's really scary to start doing it to begin with because, say, you kind of throw the PPM out, and you have to rely very much on your ears when you're doing it, which is a great thing. And so once you've established the level that you're going for, so you've analysed your quiet bit, you've analysed your loud bit, and you know, okay, well I've got this area that I'm dealing with. It is just experience, but it's having that confidence to mix like that. And I think it's difficult because people are so used to watching the BPM, watching the meters all the time.
Mark, you do some Saturday night television because I think you mix The Voice, is that right? Now that's, I mean, obviously that's an example of a very shouty program. You know, it's everything louder than everything else, but perhaps, you know, X Factor being, you know, taking that to the extreme. So do you think there's a need for the education of the producers to understand that you can't do everything like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, as Steve says, I mean, you can sit in a room and people can just say, make it louder and louder, but I mean, you could do that with PPMs, and you have to know where to pull things back and where to have a middle ground. And I think, you know, for me, starting a mix, I'm looking at the amount of compression I'm putting on things and trying to control the sound that I've got, and then obviously you start with the dialogue usually with a program, and as you add more layers onto it, then it's getting louder and louder. So I think it's just a case of getting used to the level you're working at. I mean, I find when I start a mix, I'm looking at the meter for the first hour or so, and then I just kind of just go with it, and it sort of, when I finished a part, I play the whole part through and see how it stands. But I think there are problems with stuff like those sort of Saturday night TV shows where when it all gets embedded together, it's very sort of trebly and toppy, and it can pick up quite high readings anyway on those kind of programs. But yeah, I mean those kind of deliveries aren't necessarily done at the moment to loudness levels as well. So I think.
So do you think having mixed it the way you want it, and then you're going to have to go back and mix it the way it needs to be mixed?
If it was for a loudness delivery, I would be aware of it all the way through the mix. But I think that some of the stuff on the voice would actually, there would be points which wouldn't fit with the R128 the way it's currently done. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you three have got the advantage that you can go back and do it again. Andy doesn't have the advantage because, I mean, you've been mixing the proms most recently. So perhaps could you tell us how your approach to R128 mixing differs from the post guys?
I suppose it doesn't differ really much at all, except that for me it's quite liberating to not have to worry about hitting ppm 6 and not passing it, so that's a big deal. I should probably say though that I was doing 128 this season for the HD channel. We agreed though that we'd keep the BBC 2 coverage the same, so I was doing two work streams really. But the curious thing about all that is that it didn't turn out to be too problematic, in that the two things sat together quite naturally. And apart from using some kind of limiting on the SD and BBC 2 output to stop it going through 6, and not doing it for the HD, they were quite compatible. And they sat on the PPMs in so much as you use the PPMs, they actually sat there quite comfortably as well. And I suppose that's probably the nature of the material, in that, a classical music and the orchestra is, I think, more likely to sit comfortably into the loudness ranges and the kind of loudness area that 128's pitching at. There is, I think, a compatibility issue, however, for really, if you think of it as aiming at the small television. There are kind of two markets there. There's the high-tech market. I think Andy alluded to about people with big screens. And the other market, which is people who just have small screens and very modest television speakers. And you're still aiming at two different things there, I think.
What kind of tolerance were you working to? The R128 spec says it's -23 plus or -1. In the live environment, is that achievable?
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, surprisingly so. We did 10 either live or as lives this year, and I got pretty close to that every time, really. What you'd be unhinged by would be program materials, so it was easier to get the less dynamic proms to sit there than the really wide dynamic proms. And I think the issue there is the gate. It's the dynamic gate, and if you've got an orchestra that frequently drops down to very, very quiet, even if you lift it on the faders, you can't seem to get the gate to start clocking again. So you can suddenly find that 10 minutes passes with a relatively loud value frozen. It just won't drop down. Very frustrating. That I suppose is a mismatch of how 128's designed and that particular kind of material. But other proms would sit there very well.
Have you attempted any other genres other than classical music on mixing to R128?
No, we've only done the proms in 128, but the proms has included, for example, the John Wilson Orchestra, stuff that you might regard as much more LE than a traditional classical band. That would get loud, and there the frequency content in there is much, much brighter, and you are finding, perhaps your experience there, that you would need to pull that back, and I did have to actually. You'd have to pull that back. Applause is another thing. You could be right on target, and then 3 minutes of riotous applause at the end of the concert has you right through.
And you've got no chance to pull it back.
And you've got nowhere to go with that. Right. That can be difficult. But you get close. You're not miles away with anything. It's quite close.
To talk about some short form stuff, Ben, you do some commercials. Are there particular challenges when you come to mixing to R128 for short form?
There's some things that's certainly much easier. If you're only mixing a 20 or a 30, you can mix away, and then at the end of your session you can go, right, what are my loudness levels like, run it through the meter, turn up or down according to meeting the spec. But one interesting thing that we've come across is that people from an advertising background, we're used to mixing very loud, people like a very punchy, compressed, sometimes limited sound. And now we're in a place where we can mix our stuff much more dynamically. I mean, I do a lot of Channel 4 stuff, and that's R128 currently, so we're mixing within these spec. But we find the client prefers the sound of a very compressed mix turned down to meet spec, rather than a more dynamic mix. So often I'll be mixing away and I'll get to the end of my session, and I'll have the option of either turning the threshold of a limiter down, bringing the whole mix, making it more limited, or turning the output of my limiter down, meaning you get a lower, more compressed mix. But in terms of advertising, in the UK we're still 6 ppm. I'm doing some adverts which are for Europe as well, and some of the European countries are asking for 128. So I'll have to do multiple mixes to keep everyone happy.
Do you think there are any particular workflow issues that are going to mean it's going to take longer to do a mix in R128 than it does currently?
I think you have to, when you lay back, you might have to do another pass because you're not meeting the criteria, but I mean, that's the same with any loudness readings, I think. I mean, if I work on a series, generally I find that when I lay back, it's usually spot on. But the first program, I might have to lay it back twice. Yeah.
Are there any particular kinds of material that are going to cause difficulties in mixing for R128? Things that really you can't get loud enough, but it's saying it's loud enough.
I find things like anything that's distorted at source, like walkie-talkies or just bad recording, they often register a lot higher because those frequencies are distorted, and that's what the K filter is kind of looking at there. So I find that often that stuff comes up a lot higher than if you put it in it where it should be. It would be quite low in the mix, and it's quite difficult to hear sometimes.
I want to open it up and see if anyone else wants to ask a question in the panel.
Have you guys ever sat and listened to a mix that's gone through an automatic loudness correction? And if so, what are your thoughts on that?
I've experimented with using that actually last season rather than this season, before the 128 thing came out, to see what it did. And that was really more to do with looking at the Dolby things and the dial settings and that. But I found it quite destructive. That's the thing. And you can't, I don't yet know of a tool that can, Radio 3 have the same problem with Optimal actually, on FM. It's pretty ruinous. It's okay for targeting a small speaker or something in the car, but if you're making any sort of quality listening on it, they're quite ruinous. I don't think anything can quite beat moving the faders and doing that.
Andy mentioned that most of the complaints we get from viewers are to do with the relative mix of voice against background, sound, that sort of thing. Does it actually make any difference mixing for loudness, what you can achieve in terms of balance between voice and background?
I don't think it does. I wouldn't say so. Yeah, I don't think it does.
Some of the dramas that we've done while on air where we haven't been using the meter, we mixed them, they've gone out on air, and I've had a look at it on the meter afterwards, and they're all, funnily enough, within spec, which is interesting. I think I'd say it's only when you're trying to push up levels that you end up having problems. If you're mixing things as things sort of should be heard, in a way, you're pretty much fine.
But again, it depends on what you're listening on, doesn't it? It comes back to this, ultimately, the problem is how you're delivering it home. And the reason you use compression often is to improve intelligibility. If you're listening on a nice quality system, you don't have that fight. But if you're squeezing it out of, tinny speakers out the back of a telly, there are issues about what you're aiming at and finding the compromise all the time between those two things.
My worry is if people are mixing in perhaps noisy rooms or without adequate monitoring, that's when you're going to get the bigger changes and the bigger problems.
This is good news for facilities because basically those people that insist on mixing daytime programs in the corner of the office on headphones can't be done. Well, we do that anyway without loudness, but it doesn't stop them.
For the proms, I get a nice environment. I get a specialist truck. But most of the time you're working out the back of a very noisy scanner. And they're horrible environments to balance sound in. You find that you can press hard simply so you can hear what's going on. That happens a lot. I don't know. Yeah, and that's what you get in. And it's not that the guys are doing that brutally. It's because actually they don't have much. You just intuitively do that because you're compressing your loudness range in response to the environment you're in. Now, it's relatively, I mean, I'm sitting in a nice controlled environment like you are with calibrated monitoring and I listen at the same level. But for most people working out there, that won't be the case. And I wonder how that's going to... Yeah, indeed. Well, that again comes back to... I mean, I would argue that the proms is a market that probably you can justify aiming at the high end. Probably.
Tim Middleton from Arkiva. A question I'm not sure whether you'll be able to answer, but you may be able to give me some guidance. Coming from the other end, which is TX and transmission, without a production company at the front, or one, we're having problems with people asking us to make stuff R128 compliant without considering the material that's coming into us. Now, I really don't want to put another limiter and compressor on the end of our TX chain when you guys have all worked very hard making it 128 compliant in the first place, because we'll ruin your good work. How do you mark up, or how do you let us know that your stuff is R128 compliant? Or if not, is there any a man in the background? Is there any format which will allow some metadata flagging or something along those lines?
Shall we pass the microphone across to Andy, who's just fit to burst in the corner?
I'm fit to burst on behalf of ITV Channel 4 Sky and everybody else. Who is asking you to damage our programmes?
Not your programmes. Well, no,
we really need to. Can we take this offline, because actually this is quite serious. If people are asking you to do things to channels, which is ultimately not programmes anymore, it's to channels. Then
it depends on the drivers. The drivers in our case are that people don't want to get outside the 128 constraints.
But who are the people?
Well, it's our customers, broadcasters, whoever they may be, who have bought in material from other companies, for instance, and putting together.
In that case, the DPP, you need to come to the DPP and we need to discuss this, because this is outside the remit of this, and it's very serious. If people are asking the transmission chain to affect programs, because that means we have, or these guys have, absolutely no control over it, and that's exactly what we're trying to give them back.
John Rawlings, Scramble. We mix commercials for TV. One problem we're having at the moment, I feel, as though there's a lack of overall legislation. We took on board having meters about 2-3 years ago, and to a certain extent most of what we mix, we still mix to ppm, purely because at the end of the day that's how it's judged. It's either tweaked on the line as it goes up to an individual channel, but certainly if it's a commercial for the UK, we don't necessarily know which stations it's going to be transmitted from. We don't know how it's going to be judged, and if it's going to be judged on a ppm at the end of the day, it makes sense to a certain extent to compress it maybe slightly more, knowing it's going to play out at ppm 4.5. I don't really feel that's moving forward somehow, and I think my statement is there needs to be something more of a driving force, or something like the IBA used to be years ago, to ensure these things happen.
We're getting a lot of specs in, and they're quite confusing. It will say -10 and ppm 6 and R128, and sometimes it's very hard to mix for all the masters. And in the States certainly they use the word dial norm, and they're referring to loudness. And then in other cases they're referring to a Dolby E dial norm, and then in other cases we're talking about EBU. So I still find it quite confusing. A lot of specs, and the wording's difficult.
Hi there, Matthew Basham from Creative Skill Set. We're very keen to kind of help you develop the training solutions to these issues, and I'd like to ask to what extent these skills can be learnt, and to what extent you feel they have to be kind of experienced and learnt on the job. Is it a training issue, or is it a kind of experience and mentoring issue?
The thing about 128 is it seems to me that it encourages you to have to start using your ears properly again. I don't know about you guys, but certainly when you're doing live, I think there has become over the years a tendency to become reliant on compression tools and limiting tools and all of this, and it becomes a safety net, and actually it slightly de-skills you, because you kind of work to a meter instead of using your ears. And so that's a cultural change, really, I think, that you need to, the next generation need to learn maybe some of the old ways back, it seems to me. But I'm not sure you can teach that. I think that's an environmental thing, and it's an experience that you absorb.
I think there's two levels of training that we need to address. One is absolutely operation training, which you're absolutely right. I think it's right that it's in the environment. But the biggest thing is education for the non-technical, for the production teams. And one big thing is the whole budget issue. You know, for us to sit here and say, well, actually, it may take longer because we have to address this. That actually, you're talking about turning around and saying, well, it's going to take me another hour to do this, and who's going to pay for it? So the wider educational issue is really important, and that's why I think it's great that the Academy are on board with what they're proposing to do, because they're talking, as I understand it, they're talking about doing education not just for operators, but for the wider production community. And I think it's about the education of expectation and what that practically means when you're sat making your program. And I think there's a wider issue as well, as we said, about the people who are making productions not in professional environments. And that's, again, a major training issue. I don't think there's a big problem with you guys, sort of with the training issue. I think the bigger problem is, and I think it is great for facilities and for people knowing what they're doing, but going back to what I said, I think the wider issue is expectation, education in the production. It's all very well for us to sit preaching to the converted in these environments, but it's the wider message that I think is really important.
Well, thanks very much for that panel. We're going to take another break, and in a little while we'll come back with the, as Andy's described it, the machine gun panel of the broadcasters. So in the meantime, could you thank our panel of audio mixers?